gentlemen, please put your hands together once again for Professor Pat Utomi. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Sir Chairman. Wait in. What a great pleasure, what a privilege to be able to join you this morning and to share some thoughts as interactive a manner as possible on what I like to call the leadership imperative of now. There is grave urgency. As Martin Luther King said in the days of yore, when there was great urgency regarding justice in America, the urgency of now. I'd like to speak to this, and there's a PowerPoint presentation I think will kick up by getting to this mystery word. The mystery word used so frequently, often inappropriately, is leadership. What is leadership? Who is a leader? But first, I'd like to say that leadership, very, very simply, living impact. Living a life that has impact. John Maxwell will say to you that leadership is influence. When you have influence, and that influence has impact, you achieve immortality. So leadership is about the pursuit of immortality. You know, many years ago, I was flippant in responding to an interview question. A then young man, he's not so young anymore, he's now general manager at ExxonMobil, came to interview me. And he asked me, I'd just come off an automobile mishap, which I was nearly killed, and I'd been in hospital in Europe for a while, come back. And he asked me, this was in 1991, I said, what is living? What gives meaning to existence? And before thinking, I responded. It took me 10 years to find that there was value in what I actually said. I said, to live is to pursue immortality. And that there are essentially two kinds of immortality. One kind I call material immortality, and the second I call spiritual immortality. Now, material immortality is to leave impact such that long after your body has become dust, people have you in their hearts. And one of the easiest ways to live material immortality is the written word. I said, let's take Shakespeare, for example. We take it for granted. We talk about Shakespeare as if he was our next door neighbor. Few remember that he died hundreds of years ago. So he's immortal. I gave another example. Again, I was really being flippant that day. One of my favorite people, completely misunderstood by many, who just hear one famous line from him. It's Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli in The Prince makes this profound remark that nothing is more difficult to bring about than a new order of things. Because those who profit from the old order will do everything to prevent a new order from coming by. And those who could profit from the new order do not do enough to make it happen. Because man is incredulous in his nature, not wanting to try new things until he has witnessed experience of it. I said, I'm quoting this man without thinking, without struggling, from words he wrote 580 years before. That is immortality. Machiavelli lives forever. Now the other immortality said to him that the spiritual immortality, like most people of faith aspire to be able to see God face to face someday. And that also comes from how you impact lives of other people. So ultimately, living impact can give you either or both immortalities. And so my question to you is, do you want to live forever? And it's not in doing extraordinary things, it is doing small things so well that people remember. Unfortunately for us, we leave it to a few. As a Canadian called Robin Sharma, who's really a person after my heart, because he makes a point about the fact that we are all born to lead. And he writes about the leader who had no title. Therefore, at the Center for Values in Leadership, we have a series that we call the LWT Tribute Colloquium Series. The leader who had no title. The problem with our society is that we are obsessed with titles. And many people who have titles are not leaders. But we misuse the word leader when we talk about them. They are in authority. Authority is formal power. When you are in a formal position of authority, you can say, fire that guy, and the guy gets fired. And many times people will do things because they are afraid of the consequence of your action. Which is why in 1957, an American political scientist called Robert Dahl defined power as the ability of A to make B do what B would not ordinarily want to do. But the use of power which can achieve results is not sustainable. Indeed, a British writer called Bob Garrett, writing in the book Learning to Lead many years ago, talks about the consequence of using power to get results. And that consequence is what in Nigeria we call eye service. When you are around, people do what they expect to do. As soon as you go, say, the brother don't go, say, what you do before? And so you cannot sustain doing things well through the use of power. If you want to properly locate these words, or these words, eye service, use it like a well-educated person, you know, it's street language. If you've read a little bit of organizational behavior literature like me, you will not call it eye service. You will call it a discriminant operant model of instrumental conditioning. All this double is just saying eye service. But the truth of the matter is that part of the reason we are unable to accomplish as a society is that we are driven significantly by eye service. Sycophantic behavior responding to power rather than leadership behavior in which impact, influence comes from the fact that we have knowledge and a sense of service towards others, and those people therefore follow us to achieve bigger impact for the common good of all. This is what challenges our country today. And how do we do something about it? Because the consequence of use of power is what this British guy I was going to refer to called Bob Garrett likes to nicely say is, are you giving me notice already? Oh, okay, something else. Oh, okay. Now, I was going to say, I was just warming up. What do you say? Roll it. I was just rolling it. I was just rolling it. I was saying that what Bob Garrett says happens when people use power is that you get, and I'm quoting him directly now, malicious obedience to patently stupid instructions from superiors. Most times when we act, malicious obedience to patently stupid instructions from superiors. But when we have influence, when we are making impact, people are not acting maliciously or out of fear of consequence. They are acting because they believe and agree with you on that direction to travel. So whether you are there or not there, they're traveling in that direction. And collectively, we have impact. So how can we have impact at a time like this in our country when we are challenged? Challenged as much as we are. And this is the imperative of now that I wish to share a few thoughts on with you. What are the elements of this imperative of now? Well, stagflation, recession, and the existential crisis of 2016. We're making a journey from slow growth and the years of Afro-pessimism through a commodities-driven surge and a rethinking of what was supposed to be Africa rising. Now, if you think about it, slow growth characterized development in Africa for quite some time. This fact that African economies were not growing as they should be growing led to celebrated discussions in economics about why growth was slow in Africa. Amongst the protagonists in this conversation, two people I shall mention a little further down the line, major protagonists. A British scholar, the director of the Center of African Economics at Oxford, called Paul Collier, and a professor of economics then at Harvard, who is now at Columbia, called Jeffrey Sachs. Why is growth slow in Africa? Well, Sachs makes the argument that Africa was growing slowly because Africa was destined to be poor. Well, I said it to provoke. He didn't quite mean it that way, but that's what he said. What Sachs was arguing is that Africa, because it was located in the tropics, the people of Africa are burdened by mosquitoes and malaria. And so they were often suffering from malaria so much that they didn't have the energy to produce. And so Africa was poor because of that. He meant it. He was not joking. Very serious thesis. He considered himself a great friend of Africa. He was making an argument for the world to get together and help Africa solve the problem of malaria. After that, Africa will begin to make progress. I want to assure you that the reason President Obasanjo's first major policy pronouncement was called Roll Back Malaria was advice from Jeffrey Sachs. Indeed, obvious question, he used to work at the Sachs with Sachs at Harvard. And her return to Nigeria was essentially to help the implementation of that policy. Paul Collier at Oxford says, Buncombe, Jeff is talking nonsense. Africa is poor because African leaders are making the wrong policy choices. Now, you can agree with me, but you don't have to think too far to know that I agree more with Collier than with Sachs. Even though, very interestingly, I've had the privilege of working with Sachs. In fact, I wrote the chapter in the first Africa Competitiveness Report, which Sachs and his team produced. Interestingly, I've had an interaction with Collier, which reinforces his own point about policy. Many years ago, I was a young executive at Volkswagen of Nigeria. The week after I was hired, I said that if I had my way, I would shut down the factory. Because the economic policy choice we made in that strategy of development, I thought was challenged. That strategy came out of Latin America in the 1950s, driven significantly by a gentleman called Raul Prebisch, who was the executive secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America. The Prebisch thesis is generally known as the import substitution industrialization strategy. Now that strategy of its own is not terrible. Most of the Asian economies that are growing today started with import substitution, but quickly realized that they had to switch to export-led industrialization. My perspective about ISI from day one is that it will create permanent infant industry, which is what happened in Nigeria. And this industry will never be competitive in these conditions. I argued 25, 30 years ago the point that I am arguing today that has now gained currency. And I want to talk about how Sachs and how Collier connected to that. When I was writing about these things in 1986, 1987, I received abuse across the board in Nigeria. This man does not want Nigeria to own a Nigerian car. I said, look at this, is dumb. You are doing something you can never compete well at and will eventually fail. Whereas if you just took one component in the motor business, my favorite component, rubber-based components, Nigeria had the best yield per hectare in the world of rubber. So just take rubber and agree with Mercedes-Benz, agree with Volkswagen, agree with whoever. These one or two components, we will become the lowest cost, highest quality producers in the world of this and export to your global production. You will earn more money, create more quality jobs, and drive this economy. People roundedly abused me, including those who keep asking me why did Volkswagen close down. They even accused me of being the one who closed the place down long after I had left the place. But that's neither here, that's not even the issue. The point is that Paul Collier, about 7 years ago, was commissioned by UNIDO to look at Africa's rapid rise in industrialization and what Africa can learn from it. And when Collier concluded the study, because when I was being abused in 86, 87 in Nigeria, Paul Collier came to interview me. I gave him my perspectives on the import substitution logic, which he was, fascinated by or whatever. After he finished his study of China, he said, goodness, what China did was simply do what Pat Utomi suggested Nigeria do 25 years ago. And his favorite example, which he repeats everywhere, is that 75% of all the buttons won in the whole world are made in one local government in China. And that was the thesis I had with rubber and the motor industry. 1986. So, we went through these conversations about slow growth. Slow growth resulted in what came to be known in the late 80s, early 90s as a season of Afro-pessimism. Pessimism about the prospects of Africa. Now, Afro-pessimism persisted until recent history, when India rising and China rising led to a commodities boom, buying commodities from Africa. And people began to talk about Africa rising. It wasn't too long, the expected cyclical turn led to a crash of commodity prices, and people are now questioning, was Africa really rising? In Nigeria, it has resulted in stagflation, in recession, a major existential crisis, which in my opinion was completely self-inflicted. Nigeria's current mess was self-inflicted. Nigeria inflicted this recession on itself. Very clearly, very simply, in my opinion. First, the bad behavior of previous governments who refused to save when they knew that it was an imperative of the reality of a volatile oil economy. It was the result of an elite that was too lazy to proceed with the restructuring of the Nigerian economy. As I speak with you, I don't care what anybody thinks. If you check those who run Nigeria today, they're just waiting for oil prices to rise again. You can say that anywhere. I say so. All they're doing is waiting for oil prices to rise again. We have a mentally lazy political elite that has not committed to rebuilding their country, and you must not be like them. By the way, if you study the concept of peak oil, if you study the fact that technologies that are renewable for energy advancing so rapidly that every year solar panels are more than doubling, you will realize that even if oil prices were to begin to rise again, Nigeria does not have more than 10, 15-year window for oil to be a serious factor. And so to continue to act the way we act, in my view, is simply irresponsible. What drove these problems? There is a problem of knowledge, learning, and the mind. When I was in graduate school, some 40 years ago, this is how old I am. 40 years ago, I was a PhD candidate. There was a great educator from Brazil called Paulo Freire, who wrote a remarkable book titled The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Paulo Freire, who was a great admirer of Frantz Fanon, writing about why colonized people, oppressed people, don't tend to creatively rebuild their world, essentially argued that the nature of learning that takes place, the teaching systems, pedagogy, was, the mind was like a piggy bank. You just make deposits, you just drop 10 kobo, 10 kobo. Just know enough to survive. Okay, yeah, train a few doctors so that they can ensure that the sanitary inspection is going well. And train a few engineers so the roads can be mindset that will enable you. The book was titled The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I read it in 1978 and loved it. But I had one problem. Paulo Freire was a Marxist. I was not a Marxist. A group of Roman Catholic Reverend Fathers who educated me from age 5, 6 made me realize that Marxism had no soul. And so I was never a Marxist. So when everybody on campus was comrade, I was not a comrade. So, this wonderful idea from this Marxist, how can we better adapt it? I came up with my version, which I call the pedagogy of the determined. And determined people can begin by educating themselves about how the mind can creatively work and build a new future. To educate anybody, the first thing you must do to that person is get the person to develop a vision of a different world. Develop a personal vision of themselves in that world, and then ask themselves what kind of knowledge can move them from where they are now to that new world order. And so I used to preach the pedagogy of the determined. Now, a few weeks ago, something interesting entered my order of thinking around these matters. Professor Akimabu Gunje, who we all know, has a son who is a research fellow. He's been at Stanford for the last, I was on sabbatical in 1996 at the Harvard Business School, took a little time to go to the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and I met him back then, so he's been there since that time. He came into the country a few weeks ago during this last Salah holidays, and his father called me up and said he wanted to meet with me. He's at this research center in engineering at Stanford, where they're looking at entrepreneurship and development and change, how it takes place. They had somehow come to a conclusion that of colonized peoples, the exception in being creative and making progress was the United States of America. In many ways, without thinking Freire, he had not read Freire from our, when I started talking about Freire, he was surprised. But thinking Freire without knowing Freire in terms of colonized minds and how they affect creativity and growth. And so the US exception. And their research question is, how do you break that US exception in entrepreneurship? But I have my thoughts on the US exception. It is actually not so much, but part of the argument by the way at Stanford is that language is very important. That the US was able to break out of the colonial mindset by creating its own language, even though it was English. But instead of using the Oxford Dictionary, the Americans created their own dictionary. That's part of Again, the Stanford thesis. In my mind, what happened with the US was that they had an institutional building mechanism that allowed them to be far-sighted people. This troublesome but great historian at Harvard and the Scottish guy, Ferguson, Neil Ferguson, in the book Civilization, argues that the making of the 1788 Constitution of the United States was probably the most profound activity of institution building in human history. And that's his thesis, that's his argument. But the point is, from that effort, institution building was so central in American work that a remarkable book written a few years ago by an Indian professor at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business and one of his colleagues called Luigi Zingales. That Indian professor is just finishing his term as governor of the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank. Raghuram Rajan and his colleague Luigi Zingales writes this remarkable book titled Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. And in this book, they argue that while the United States is one of the most renewable countries in terms of entrepreneurship and economic development, is a series of judgments from the US legal system dominated by some of the thinking of one-time US Supreme Court Justice called Charles Brandeis. So, let's leave all these theses and what happened in US exception. When the miracle economies of Asia, as they were called, the tiger economies, began to emerge, to break this sense of US exception, there were all kinds of theses trying to explain what happened there. And one Malaysian economist, who, by the way, gave a speech in this place, this very building. Was it building up? No, I wasn't here when he came. I was around here. I was here. I don't know. He came some years ago, brought by UBA to give a lecture. His name is K.S. Jomo. And K.S. Jomo argues that all these theories about what happened in East Asia is nonsense. What simply happened in Asia was one country at the tip of the Straits of Malacca began to get it right. Country is Singapore. And the Malaysians looked across the border and said, hey, no, these guys are not going to run away. And they began to make progress. And the Thais looked. Before you knew it, Southeast Asia was a flock of flying geese. And this is why Nigeria is so important, because if Nigeria gets it right, West Africa will flock with it, and Africa will get it right. Which is why the kind of leadership we have in Nigeria used to annoy Nelson Mandela. I'm sure most of us have read the famous interview with Baba Ahmed. Mandela was so frustrated with Nigeria not being able to get his act together in terms of leaders. And he said really painful things about it. How do we wake up Nigeria to lead? So that the thoughts about why growth is slow in Africa, especially people like William Easterly, along with the ones I talked about earlier, are not the things that define us. Years ago, I put together in a book titled Why Nations Are Poor, this framework of what is critical to making progress for a nation. You have to get your policies right. You've got to build strong institutions. You've got to develop human capital. You've got to essentially have an entrepreneurship culture that enables you to creatively destroy and rebuild. And values shape human progress. All of these things are possible because of your values. You know, all of you young people, I tell you, when I go to Malaysia, when people are going home after work, you see two young people, you know what they're arguing? Who worked harder today? In Nigeria, young people are going to bed, what are they arguing? Ishe kekere, ola. How you can make plenty of money from doing very small, very little, and stuff like that. Those are values that shape a society. Your work ethic, your respect for the dignity of the human person, and all kinds of values that determine progress. But how do these values come? Leaders set the tone of culture. And so in Nigeria, that man is tarring many roads. He's tarring many roads. What fantastic governor is tarring roads. And as I keep saying to people, even a moron can sign a check for Julius Berger to build a road. What it takes to lead is not roads being built. What it takes to lead is to conscientize the people such that they know that if a road is being built, 2 years from now, you will need to expand it. Every 6 months, you will need to go and maintain parts of it, and so on and so forth. That is what leadership is about, not tarring roads. And so this framework, which I call the Great Drivers Framework, has been a defining thesis in our quest for understanding of how growth can be sustained. But what has happened in the Nigerian experience? Well, what we have unfortunately seen in Nigeria is a universalization of discontent. As Chido Onuma's book recently put it, we are all Biafrans now. Everybody feels marginalized in Nigeria. Everybody is unhappy in Nigeria. Everybody. How did we get here? What explanations do we have for getting here? For me, the explanation is increasingly clearer. The explanation comes from a concept of state capture. What I call the tragedy of the class of 1966. If you look closely, if you are studious, Nigeria has been in a state of state capture from 1966 to 2016 by a small group of young officers in 1966. They took Nigeria over 1966 and they're still running Nigeria now. Because they were in their 20s and 30s, they swallowed the heritage of their fathers. They took their own portion. They consumed the heritage of their children, and they are now damaging the prospects of their great-grandchildren. The class of 1966. The trouble with Nigeria, everybody argues, and Achebe gave impetus to leadership. Why are we struggling with leadership in Nigeria? Why did the Suhartos create a condition that took Indonesia out of the rut? How did Suharto find a group of young PhDs, mostly graduates of the University of California, Berkeley at the time? And so they came to be known in Indonesia as the Berkeley Mafia. I was very friendly with one of them, who has since passed. He used to be oil minister in Indonesia, Professor Mohammed Sadli. When I visited Professor Sadli in 1997, he was a former oil minister of Indonesia. He lived on a nice bungalow on top of a hill, but he didn't have air conditioning in Jakarta, which is as hot as Lagos. Former oil minister. And one of his favorite subjects was ethics. Yes, Indonesia was supposed to be a corrupt country, but Suharto, who was known to be very corrupt, found a core of smart academics who put a great nation. So good that in the early 60s, it used to be said, we wish Indonesia could be like Nigeria. By the late 80s and early 90s, they said, we wish Nigeria could be like Indonesia. And a friend of mine, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, called Peter Lewis, went on to write a book titled Growing Apart, the story of Nigeria and Indonesia. As I try to analyze this, as I try to look at what General Park did in South Korea, I begin to realize that the class of 66 needed to be better understood. And a new framework around a new book I'm writing, I'm actually working on 2 books right now. One of them is titled 50 Years. It's about the class of 66 and state capture in Nigeria. And the second book is titled The Path from Servitude, which is in effect a take from Hayek's famous The Road to Serfdom. If we travel the road to serfdom, how do we journey out of servitude? These are the two books I'm writing now. One is a purely political science book, the other is a purely economics book. In my thought about 50 years of state capture in Nigeria, I break the class of 66 into 3 groups. One group I call the modernizer wannabes. This group want to modernize their country. They would like to be like Suharto. They would like to be like Park. Indeed, they fit what the Argentine scholar Guillermo O'Donnell calls the bureaucratic authoritarian thesis, excluding coalitions of technocratic and bureaucratic and political elites who are focused on modernizing. The problem with the class of 66 is that the group that I call the modernizer wannabes do not have the personal discipline to execute. So whereas they want their country to be great, their sense for laissez-faire made them institutionalize corruption in the country. And so their desire was not accomplished. The class of 66 has a central party, as I call them. And that central party, I call it narcissistic influencers, dominated completely by self-love. They want to be always in charge. They're around every time. They must be relevant. Some people are mentioning names. You can add whatever names you want. Some of those who always want to be around and to determine everything and to be relevant, there are some amongst them who don't even care if you know that they're there, but they want to be given their oil wells. They want to determine who is appointed minister of that and minister of this. They are the narcissistic influencers of the class of 66. And very often they determine the swing between the modernizer wannabes and the third category, which I call the entitlement-minded Praetorian Guards. Entitlement-minded Praetorian Guards believe that they kept Nigeria warm, and therefore it's their divine right to rule Nigeria. Whether they have a clue what to do with Nigeria or not, doesn't matter. It is in working our way through an understanding of the thesis of 50 years that the new leadership challenge for us. What has happened in Nigeria, very sadly, is what I call, and I'm surprised it's not here, the paradox of progressive degeneration. You learn, and you grow, and you build. What has happened to the mindset of the hunter that I said is the dominant characteristic of the class of 66 is that we don't unlearn to learn. We don't climb a learning curve. And because we don't climb that learning curve, we are traveling around in cycles. Progressively in Nigeria, every government is worse than the one before it. Progressively. Worse. Because we have not learned to learn. I call it the paradox and mystery of degeneration. And it comes from the hunter mindset. I'll leave you there. Thank you.